Imagine, for a moment, the ultimate A-plus student.
Right.
You're looking at this massive global assessment of over 200 countries and territories.
Right.
And it's basically measuring who has built the most successful, most advanced society on Earth.
The top of the class.
Exactly. And sitting very comfortably in the top 10, at number 8 to be exact, is Hong Kong.
Yep.
With a staggering score of 0.955 out of a possible 1.0 on the Human Development Index in 2023.
Which is incredibly high.
It's massive.
Yeah.
They are, by all standard metrics, completely winning at the game of human progress.
Yeah.
But then you put on a pair of X-ray glasses.
Yeah, I love this analogy.
Right. You apply this specific, totally invisible filter to that exact same data. A filter that accounts for how that progress is actually distributed among the people living there.
And that's when the picture changes.
Completely changes.
Yes.
Instantly, that gleaming number 8 rank just plummets off a cliff. It drops all the way down to number 24.
That's a huge drop.
It is. That absolute advantage, that top-tier status, it just vanishes into thin air.
It's really the ultimate paradox of modern development, you know? We are so conditioned to look at the shiny veneer of top-level economic data and just, well, assume that the high tide is lifting every single boat.
Right. The rising tide lifts all ships.
Exactly. But when a society drops 16 places on the global stage, simply by looking at the exact same data through a more honest lens, it forces us to ask a very uncomfortable question.
Which is?
Where exactly did that human progress go?
And that is exactly what we are going to figure out today. Welcome to a deep dive into the invisible dimensions of human development.
It's going to be a fascinating one.
Oh, absolutely. Our mission here is to basically tear apart this massive multi-decade data set. It covers global progress from 1990 all the way to 2023.
Which is a huge span of time.
It is. We're going to look at the hidden costs of becoming a top-tier society. We're looking at the blind spots in how we actually measure success. And we're going to use Hong Kong as our ultimate masterclass case study.
Because it really is the perfect prototype for this.
Right. Because whether you live in a booming metropolis or, a quiet suburb, the math that dictates who thrives and who gets left behind is operating in your life right now.
It truly is. But to understand why that ranking drops so dramatically and what that actually means for the lived experience of millions of people, we can't just skip to the end.
No, we have to lay the groundwork.
We have to start by understanding the baseline. We need to look at that initial A-plus score and unpack exactly how the globe as a whole is performing. And more importantly, how we even define a word as loaded as progress in the 21st century.
So let's talk about the standard yardstick.
Oh.
Because for the longest time, if you wanted to know if a country was developing, you really just asked one extraordinarily simple question.
How big is your bank account?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gross domestic product. GDP. It was the ultimate single metric. Did your country produce more goods and services, like more widgets and financial transactions this year than it did last year?
If the line went up, congratulations, your society was progressing.
Right. And that single-minded focus, it created a massive systemic blind spot for economists and policymakers alike.
Oh, a huge one. Relying solely on GDP forces a society into a very narrow corridor of thinking. It basically assumes that wealth generation automatically translates to human well-being.
Which we know isn't true.
Right. But eventually, the developmental economics community had a reckoning. They realized that asking, well, how much money does this country have, is fundamentally the wrong question.
Yeah, because if a nation makes $1 trillion by working its citizens to the bone in these hazardous conditions, and they die by the age of 40, is that really a developed nation?
Exactly. What good is a mountain of capital if your citizens don't have the physical health to live a long life? Or, the foundational education to actually innovate, understand their world, and enjoy that wealth?
They can't even use it.
Right. And that philosophical shift is what birthed the Human Development Index, or the HDI. It was introduced by the United Nations Development Program back in 1990.
Okay, so let's set the stage with how the source material visualizes this. The presentation we're diving into has this great visual for slide 2. It's a very clean, minimalist tree structure.
Yes, the 3 branches.
Right. So you have the HDI at the root, and it branches out into 3 distinct pillars: health, education, and economy. So let's break down how this yardstick actually works, because it's going to be the foundation for everything we talk about today.
Okay, let's start with the first branch on that tree, health.
Which is measured by a very straightforward but incredibly powerful metric, right?
Yes. Life expectancy at birth. It essentially answers the question, how many years does the average person get to exist in this society?
And it's not just about age, is it?
No, not at all. Life expectancy is a brilliant proxy for 1,000 other invisible factors. You cannot achieve a high life expectancy without clean drinking water,
Right.
or widespread vaccination programs, a functioning healthcare system, maternal care, a secure food supply. It captures the physical safety of a society in a single number.
That makes total sense. Okay, so the second branch of our HDI tree is education, which, if I remember correctly, is actually split into two different measurements.
It is. First, it looks at the expected years of schooling for a young child just entering the education system today.
Okay.
And second, it looks at the mean or average years of schooling for adults who are already out in the workforce.
Why split it up like that? What's the distinction?
Well, it's a crucial distinction. Expected schooling tells you about the ambition and capacity of the current system, like what is the government providing for the future.
Got it.
Whereas mean years of schooling tells you about the historical accumulation of knowledge. It measures the intellectual capital that is currently driving the society right now.
Oh, that's really interesting. It's like looking at the pipeline versus the reservoir.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, and finally, the third branch is the economy. But they don't just use raw GDP here, do they?
No, they use gross national income, or GNI per capita.
And this is where we really need to pause and explain a slightly technical term that fundamentally changes how we view wealth: purchasing power parity.
PPP, yes.
Right, PPP. Because the HDI adjusts the income for PPP.
Yeah.
Let's make sure everyone listening understands what that actually means in the real world.
Well, purchasing power parity is really the great equalizer in global economics. Let's say you earn $50,000 a year.
Okay.
In a rural town in the Midwestern United States, $50,000 might buy you a very comfortable lifestyle, a mortgage on a house, plenty of groceries, maybe a car.
Sure.
But if you take that exact same $50,000 and move to downtown Manhattan or the center of London,
You were going to be struggling to rent a tiny studio apartment.
exactly. The raw number is the same, but the reality of what that number provides is drastically different.
Okay, so the value of money is inextricably linked to the cost of living in the place where you spend it.
Precisely. So when the HDI calculates a country's economic strength, it adjusts the GNI based on purchasing power parity. It essentially asks, how many actual loaves of bread, how much health care, how much shelter can the average citizen buy with their income in their specific local economy?
It translates raw currency into actual human utility.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so you have these three branches: health, knowledge, and the purchasing power to sustain a decent standard of living. And when you synthesize them, it acknowledges that human development is fundamentally about the expansion of human choices.
That's the key.
Right, because you need the education to know what your choices are. You need the health and longevity to actually be alive to make those choices. And you need the economic power to afford to execute them.
It is a profound shift in perspective, and the data we have, it traces the global trajectory of this three-branch tree over an incredible 30-year span,
Yeah.
from 1990 right up to 2023.
The source presentation actually visualizes this beautifully on slide 3. It's a stark white background with this deep blue line charting the global average.
Yes, the 30-year roller coaster.
So let's look at the macro picture first. What has the world, as an aggregate whole, been doing for the last 3 decades?
Yeah.
Back in 1990, the global average HDI was 0.608.
Right. And since 1.0 is a perfect utopia, 0.608 means the world was sitting in a state of medium development.
Medium development, okay.
Yeah.
But from that starting point, over the next 30 years, we see this steady, resilient, almost beautiful upward climb.
It really is striking when you look at it.
By the year 2000, the globe hit 0.651. By 2010, we reached 0.707, crossing into the high development tier. And by 2019, the world was sitting at a record high of 0.745.
When you visualize that curve, that deep blue line, it is a testament to the most successful period of poverty reduction and health advancement in human history.
I mean, think about what was driving that 30-year upward trend. You had the eradication of certain infectious diseases.
Massive leaps in agricultural efficiency, pulling hundreds of millions out of extreme starvation.
Yes, and global campaigns that dramatically increased the enrollment of girls in primary education across developing nations.
For 30 straight years, despite wars, despite massive financial crises like the 2008 market crash, the overall trajectory of human capability marched relentlessly upward.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around. It's like looking at a stock market chart during a generation-defining bull run. Just a smooth line up and to the right year after year. Every time a localized crisis hit, the broader global momentum just absorbed it and kept climbing.
But then,
Yeah, then we hit the historical stumble.
yes, on that slide 3 visual, there is a very prominent red dashed circle highlighting a massive V-shaped crater.
For the first time since the inception of the index, the continuous upward streak broke.
In 2020, the global HDI dropped from 0.745 down to 0.742.
And what it was perhaps more terrifying is that it did not immediately bounce back. The world stayed stagnant at that lower level of 0.742 throughout 2021.
We are obviously talking about the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic and the cascading geopolitical and supply chain shocks that followed in its wake.
But seeing the impact abstracted into this single global number is deeply sobering. It is a literal V-shaped crater carved into 3 decades of progress.
We really need to pause and unpack the mechanics of that crater because it reveals a massive underlying fragility in our global systems.
Okay, let's do it.
Think about the 3 branches of the index. To cause the global average to visibly drop, you are talking about an event of staggering magnitude.
Right.
You are talking about millions of human beings losing years off their statistical life expectancies simultaneously due to a novel virus.
Yeah, that's the health branch taking a massive hit.
Exactly. And then you are talking about schools shutting down across entire continents, severely depressing the expected years of schooling for a whole generation of children who are locked out of classrooms.
The education branch.
And finally, you are talking about global economic contraction destroying livelihoods.
It was a simultaneous attack on all 3 pillars of human development.
Exactly. The HDI is designed to be a relatively slow-moving, stable metric. It takes a massive amount of inertia to move the global average even a fraction of a point.
So for it to actually drop.
The fact that the pandemic caused a multi-year regression shows that our progress is not an inevitable law of physics. It is highly contingent on the stability of our global environment.
Wow. Now, the data does show a recovery. By 2023, the global average HDI finally rebounded and surpassed the pre-pandemic peak, reaching 0.756. Humanity absorbed the blow and started climbing again.
But that scar on the timeline remains. It is a permanent reminder that development can be reversed.
Now, I want to step in here and push back on this whole global narrative for a second.
Sure.
If you are listening to this on your commute or, while walking your dog, you might be thinking, okay, a global average of 0.756 is an interesting trivia fact, but why should I care? My local reality looks absolutely nothing like a global average.
And that is a very valid critique of this kind of macro data.
Right. A global average lumps together the tech billionaires of Silicon Valley with the subsistence farmers of South Sudan. It smooths all the extreme highs and extreme lows into this gray blur.
Yes, it tells you the average temperature of the entire planet, but it doesn't tell you if a hurricane is currently destroying your specific hometown.
That's exactly it.
And that is precisely why the most illuminating part of the research we are diving into doesn't stay at the global level. It zooms in incredibly tightly on one specific, highly developed ecosystem.
Hong Kong?
Yes. We have to look at a society operating at the absolute bleeding edge of human development to understand where this standard yardstick works, and more importantly, where it begins to fail.
Let's do that. Let's zoom in and look at the anatomy of the Hong Kong miracle. Because having just established that the world average in 2023 was 0.756, the fact that Hong Kong achieved a score of 0.955 is just staggering.
It places them in the absolute stratosphere, number 8 in the world.
But they didn't just magically appear there. The presentation outlines this incredible story of a structural climb over those same 30 years. On slide 4, they use this step-by-step chart with a green arrow piercing upwards to show the trajectory.
It is a masterclass in aggressive, targeted societal development. If we rewind back to 1990, Hong Kong's HDI was 0.755. At that time, they were ranked number 30 in the world.
Now, number 30 is still very solid. I mean, it places them in the high human development category. But it is not the top-tier global elite status they hold today.
Not at all. And the climb was not easy. Throughout the 1990s and well into the 2000s, they were essentially hovering around the rank of 24 or 25. They were stuck in this mid-20s plateau for almost a decade and a half.
Which I imagine is incredibly common in developmental economics.
Oh, absolutely. Breaking out of the top 30 and into the top 10 is notoriously difficult. It's not like the countries ahead of you are standing still.
Right. Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, they're all advancing rapidly too.
Exactly. To move up the rankings at that level, you can't just rely on incremental improvements. You can't just build a few more hospitals or tweak a tax policy. You are running on a treadmill that keeps speeding up.
So what do you have to do?
To overtake the nations ahead of you, you need sweeping generational transformations across all the pillars of your society.
But Hong Kong actually pulls it off.
Hmm.
Something shifts. By 2012, they break into the top 15, hitting rank number 12 with a score of 0.923.
Yes.
By 2016, they reached number 8. And astonishingly, they actually peaked at number 4 in the entire world in both 2018 and 2021, scoring an incredible 0.961 in 2021 before settling back to number 8 in 2023.
It's an incredible leap.
So to understand how you engineer a leap like that, we have to pull apart those 3 branches we talked about earlier. Let's start with health, because the data coming out of Hong Kong here is almost hard to comprehend.
It really is. They've achieved what we might call a longevity ceiling.
The slide that covers this uses these horizontal bar charts comparing Hong Kong to the rest of the world, and the visual gap is just massive.
The life expectancy figures are the defining characteristic of the Hong Kong dataset. In 2023, the expected lifespan for a female born in Hong Kong is 88.13 years.
88.13.
Yes. And for males, it is 82.84 years.
Let's just pause and let that sink in for a second. 88.13 years.
Yeah.
Let me contrast that with the global averages we were just discussing. Globally, the average female life expectancy is 75.9 years. And for males, it is just under 71 years.
We are looking at a gap of over 12 years for females in Hong Kong compared to the global average.
Over a decade.
That is more than a decade of extra human life. And from a purely mathematical standpoint, within the HDI formula, a female life expectancy of over 88 years acts as a massive, powerful upward force. It pulls the entire composite score toward that perfect 1.0.
But let's look at the human reality behind that math. How does a dense, hyper-urbanized territory achieve that? You don't get an entire population living to an average of 88 by accident.
Absolutely not. It requires an alignment of multiple societal factors. It speaks to a public healthcare system that is exceptionally accessible and efficient at treating chronic diseases of aging.
Okay, so medical access is huge.
Yes. It also speaks to an urban infrastructure that, despite being densely packed, manages sanitation, public transit, and emergency response at world-class levels.
What about lifestyle factors?
Oh, heavily involved. It reflects dietary habits, incredibly low rates of violent crime, and a cultural structure that actively supports an aging population. When you eliminate early mortality from disease, crime, and accidents, the statistical average pushes right up against the biological limits of the human body.
It's an incredible achievement. But let's build an analogy here to really visualize this data, because I think it helps ground all these numbers. If we picture Hong Kong's HDI score as a towering, gleaming skyscraper, that 88-year life expectancy is the penthouse. It is the highest, most visible, most celebrated achievement.
I like that.
But you cannot suspend a penthouse in midair. To support an aging population that lives that long, you need an incredibly strong foundation and an unyielding steel frame. In our HDI model, that foundation is knowledge, and the steel frame is capital.
That is a perfect way to visualize it, because a society with massive longevity but no wealth or education would simply be a society enduring a very long period of poverty.
Right.
The accumulation of capital and knowledge in Hong Kong is what makes the longevity a marker of high development. Let's look at the steel frame, the wealth.
The presentation uses a really stark visual for this on slide 6. A matrix comparing Hong Kong's income bars against the global average bars. And it's night and day.
If we examine the gross national income per capita for 2023, and remember this is adjusted for that purchasing power parity we discussed earlier, so it reflects true buying power.
Right, actual purchasing utility.
Yes. The male GNI is $85,162, and the female GNI is $56,528.
And again, to ground this in reality, let's look at the rest of the world. The global average female GNI is less than $15,000, and the male is roughly $25,000.
So Hong Kong is operating in a completely different financial universe. Their citizens command extraordinary purchasing power.
And that wealth generation is driven by the foundation, the knowledge accumulation. The mean years of schooling for an adult in Hong Kong is 12.35 years.
Which means when you look at the entire adult population, including the older generations who typically have less formal education, the average person has completed primary school, completed secondary school, and moved into higher education or specialized vocational training.
The baseline intellectual capital is incredibly high.
Yes. So when you combine a workforce that has over 12 years of foundational knowledge, you power an economic engine that generates an average of $85,000 in purchasing power, which in turn funds a society where people live to be 88 years old.
That is the anatomy of the A-plus student. That is how you achieve a 0.955 on the Human Development Index.
Exactly.
We've built the skyscraper. It is gleaming, it is tall, and it is the absolute envy of the developing world.
Right.
But now it is time to fulfill the promise we made at the very beginning of this deep dive. It is time to put on the X-ray glasses.
Here we go.
Because the standard HDI, for all its improvements over raw GDP, makes one incredibly dangerous, highly flawed assumption.
It assumes that the penthouse, the steel frame, and the foundation are shared equally by every single person in the building.
Which is never true.
Never. The standard HDI looks at the total wealth, the total years lived, and the total education of a society, and it simply divides by the number of people. It creates a flawless, frictionless average. But we know, instinctively and factually, that human societies do not operate without friction.
Right. It's a classic statistical trap. I always use the class average analogy. If you have two people in a room and one person has $10 million and the other person is completely bankrupt with $0, their average wealth is $5 million.
Right.
On paper, looking only at the average, you have a room full of multimillionaires. In reality, half the room is starving to death.
That is the exact blind spot that economists realized they needed to address, and so the United Nations developed a secondary metric.
The Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, or the IHDI.
Yes. Think of the IHDI as an efficiency tax on a society's progress. It looks at the baseline HDI score, and then it systematically discounts that score based on how unequally the health, education, and wealth are actually distributed across the population.
So it penalizes them for disparity.
Exactly. If a country has perfect equality, its HDI and IHDI are identical. But the more polarization there is, the wider the gap between the haves and the have-nots, the more human potential is wasted, and the lower the adjusted score falls.
This is our first invisible filter, the cost of inequality. And when we apply this filter to the Hong Kong data from 2023, the results are nothing short of a shock to the system.
They really are.
The visual for this on slide 7 is fantastic. It's a waterfall chart. You start at the high point of 0.955, and then there's this big red block dropping down to 0.839.
Yes, that red block represents the loss.
It represents a 12.15% loss of total human development. More than a tenth of the society's potential is just burned up in the friction of inequality.
Gone.
And because other top-tier nations have more equitable distributions, Hong Kong's global rank plummets. They fall from number 8 down to number 24.
Now, as analysts, we have to be fiercely impartial to the data here. We must provide context. The world is, unfortunately, a highly unequal place. When you apply this same inequality filter to the global average, the world actually loses a staggering 21.96% of its development.
Low. Almost a quarter?
Yes. So, compared to the global average, Hong Kong is technically less unequal. However, for a top-tier, highly resourced economy operating in the top 10, a 12% penalty is a massive, glaring drag on their true potential. It represents millions of people not fully participating in the miracle we just described.
So we have to deconstruct this pain point. Where exactly is this 12.15% loss coming from? Because it's not a uniform drop across all areas of life, is it?
No, not at all.
And the slide covering this, slide 8, breaks it down using 3 horizontal dumbbell charts. And one of them is highlighted in a very alarming warning color.
Because when you fracture the data and look at the 3 pillars independently, a very clear, very specific structural issue emerges. Let's look at the inequality in the health branch first. When the data measures the variance in life expectancy across different socioeconomic groups in Hong Kong, the inequality rate is incredibly low. It sits at just 2.28%.
Which is a phenomenal public policy achievement. A health inequality of 2.28% means that the 88-year life expectancy is a genuinely shared reality.
Yes.
You don't have this dystopian scenario where the ultra-rich are living to be 95, while the working class lacks basic health care and dies at 60.
Exactly. The public health infrastructure, the disease prevention, the sanitation, these are public goods that protect the vast majority of citizens, regardless of their income bracket.
So the health gains are democratized. Okay, next we look at the education branch. The inequality in education distribution sits at 8.68%.
Which indicates a bit more friction. There is certainly some disparity in the quality of schooling or the ability of lower-income families to keep their children in tertiary education compared to wealthy families who can afford private tutoring and elite universities.
But an 8.68% variance is still relatively manageable, right?
Okay. It shows that the vast majority of the population is successfully moving through the foundational school system.
But then we apply the inequality filter to the third branch, the economy.
This is where that warning color on the chart comes in.
Exactly. This is where the X-ray glasses reveal a massive crack in the foundation. The income inequality in Hong Kong is a flashing red light. It sits at a staggering 24.08%.
24.08%. This is the critical diagnosis. Let's synthesize what this means.
Okay.
The basic necessities of a modern, dignified life, physical health, and foundational education are distributed fairly equitably. The society is ensuring its people are alive and literate.
Right.
But the financial gains of the economy, the actual wealth being generated by this highly educated, long-living workforce, are intensely concentrated at the very top.
It perfectly mirrors my class average analogy from earlier. The physical and intellectual capacity is spread across the board, but the financial rewards of that capacity are siloed. Almost a quarter of the economic development potential is lost to the friction of wealth concentration.
Exactly.
But I am going to stop you here because I want to play devil's advocate for a minute.
Sure, go ahead.
I want to push back on the idea that this is necessarily a failure. If you look at the reality of what Hong Kong is, it is one of the premier global financial hubs on the planet.
Undeniably.
It is designed to be a hyper-capitalist engine that attracts international banking, trade, and corporate headquarters. So if you are building an economy entirely around high-stakes finance and global trade, isn't a massive degree of income inequality just a mathematical certainty?
That's a fair question.
Right. Like, can you actually engineer an $85,000 average GNI without creating a class of billionaires at the top and service workers at the bottom? Isn't this extreme polarization just the inevitable exhaust fume of that specific economic engine?
That is exactly the debate that rages in modern developmental economics. And yes, you are entirely correct that a global financial hub will naturally attract and concentrate capital. It is an agglomeration effect.
The money clusters together.
Right. The highest paying jobs in global finance cluster together, which naturally skews the top end of the income distribution. However, looking at it purely as an inevitable byproduct ignores the role of policy.
How so?
An inequality drag of 24% indicates that the mechanisms meant to counterbalance that natural concentration, whether through progressive taxation, robust social safety nets, affordable public housing initiatives, or aggressive wage growth at the lower ends of the labor market, they are fundamentally failing to keep pace with the wealth generation at the top.
So it's not that the billionaires exist, it's that the system isn't capturing enough of that top-end momentum to pull the bottom up at the same speed.
Precisely. It implies that a massive, invisible segment of the population is trapped in a paradox. They are experiencing the hyperinflated costs of living in a top-tier global city, the exorbitant rent, the expensive groceries, but they are entirely locked out of the top-tier incomes required to afford it comfortably.
That sounds incredibly stressful.
It is. That 24% drag isn't just a number. It is a structural fiction that breeds social resentment, limits economic mobility, and ultimately makes the society less resilient to shocks.
Okay, so that is our first hidden dimension unpacked. We see the massive gap between the rich and the poor and how it strips away the illusion of a perfect society.
But inequality is not just about social class.
No, it's not. It is not just about the C-suite executive versus the barista. Inequality is also about the fundamental divide between men and women, which brings us to our second invisible filter, the gender paradox.
To measure this, economists use the Gender Development Index, or the GDI.
And how does that differ from the regular HDI?
It is a brilliant tool. It picks the exact same three pillars we've been discussing, health, education, and income. But it calculates the HDI score entirely separately for men and for women.
Okay.
And then it looks at the ratio between the two. A GDI score of exactly 1.0 means perfect parity. Men and women are experiencing the exact same level of human development.
And if you just glance at the top-line summary, Hong Kong looks like a massive success story here as well. Their GDI score for 2023 is 0.976.
That is incredibly close to a perfect 1.0.
It is. In fact, the United Nations categorizes them in Group 1, which is reserved for countries with high equality and HDI achievements between women and men. But, just like the wealth data, when we refuse to accept the single number at face value.
When you dig into the specific data points feeding that 0.976,
Yes. An absolutely bizarre, almost heartbreaking contradiction emerges.
it is a profound structural paradox, and it revolves primarily around education and labor. Let's look at the pipeline of human capital.
The visual they use for this in the presentation is this overlapping radar chart, or area chart, and it perfectly illustrates the tension.
If we examine the expected years of schooling for a young child entering the educational system in 2023, we see a historical crossover. The expected years of schooling for a female in Hong Kong is 16.9 years.
16.9 years.
And the expected years for a male is actually slightly lower at 16.8 years.
Let me frame how massive an achievement that is. For centuries, across almost every culture on Earth, the education of women was secondary, if it existed at all.
Absolutely.
Here you have a society that is not only willing, but is highly successful at educating young women to the absolute highest global standards. They are dedicating nearly 17 years of their lives to the classroom, actively outpacing their male peers.
Yes.
The society has engineered this incredible, state-of-the-art pipeline of female intellectual capital.
It is a triumph of developmental access. But the paradox reveals itself the exact moment those women graduate. We have to look at what happens when they transition from the classroom into the broader economy.
This is where that overlapping chart shows a massive gap opening up.
Right. Despite possessing higher expected education levels, the female labor force participation rate in Hong Kong is drastically disproportionately lower. In 2023, only 52.24% of women aged 15 and older are actively participating in the labor force.
Let's compare that to the men. The male labor force participation rate sits at 63.59%. That is an 11% gap.
And remember those gross national income figures we broke down earlier?
Oh, right. The male GNI was over 85,000, while the female GNI was roughly 56,000.
Yes.
This is what I find so fascinating and honestly frustrating about this data. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine a society decides to invest millions of dollars to build a fleet of state-of-the-art Formula One race cars. They use the best engineers, the best materials, the most advanced technology. That is the 16.9 years of world-class education.
Right.
But the moment those cars are fully built and ready to race, the society just takes half of them and parks them in a garage permanently.
It makes no logical sense.
Why on earth would a society spend 17 years building intellectual capacity if the economic engine is not structured to actually utilize it?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question for global economics, and the data gives us a very clear clue. When you visualize this on a graph, the lines tracking male and female achievement cross each other in the classroom. Women pull ahead.
Yes, the crossover.
But the moment the timeline shifts to the boardroom, to the labor market, the lines wildly diverge. Men's incomes and participation soar, and women's plateau or drop.
So what does that tell us?
This tells us something crucial. The barriers to gender equality in this society are no longer about capability. They're not about access to early resources or health or intelligence.
The women are demonstrably more educated.
Exactly. The barriers are deeply structural and cultural, and they exist almost entirely within the adult workplace and the home.
So we need to talk about the mechanisms of those barriers.
Yeah.
Why does a woman with a master's degree exit the workforce at a higher rate than her male counterpart?
It boils down to a collision between a hyper-competitive, demanding capitalist work culture and deeply entrenched traditional gender norms regarding caregiving.
Ah.
In highly developed economies like Hong Kong, the workplace demands extreme hours and unwavering dedication to climb the corporate ladder.
The hustle culture.
Right. Simultaneously, the societal expectation remains that women bear the overwhelming majority of the burden for unpaid care work.
Which means raising children.
Raising children, managing the household, and increasingly caring for elderly parents, which is a massive factor given that 88-year life expectancy we discussed.
It's a squeeze play. They're getting squeezed from both sides.
Exactly. When you combine the astronomically high cost of private childcare, a lack of flexible working arrangements from major corporations, and cultural norms that view maternal care as the default, highly educated women are essentially forced to make an impossible economic calculation.
The math just doesn't work out for them to stay in.
For many, leaving the workforce entirely or stepping down to lower-paying part-time roles becomes the only viable way to manage the dual demands of a hypereconomy and a family. The pipeline springs a massive leak the exact moment graduation ends.
Think about this from a purely objective, systemic design perspective. If you, the listener, were tasked with designing an optimized society from scratch, this is an incredibly inefficient blueprint. It's a tremendous loss of economic potential.
Huge loss.
If you could restructure the workplace, if you could implement systemic childcare, normalize paternity leave, and close that 11% participation gap, the economic output and the resulting HDI would skyrocket even further.
It absolutely would. However, to maintain our impartial view of the data, we must also look at another index related to gender, the Gender Inequality Index, or GII.
Right, because it's not all bad news.
No, it's not. Because while the labor market shows severe friction, the GII, which measures reproductive health and political or corporate empowerment, shows that Hong Kong has achieved immense success in other critical areas of female autonomy.
Yes, the data on reproductive health is undeniable, and it acts as a real counterbalance to the labor story. The presentation highlights this with a really stark bubble chart on slide 10. You have this tiny little dot representing Hong Kong next to this massive inflated bubble representing the global average.
It's illustrating the adolescent birth rate.
Yes, the number of births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19. In Hong Kong, that rate is an incredibly low 1.12.
1.12.
Let me give you the global context for that.
Here.
The global average adolescent birth rate is a staggering 39.0. We're talking about 1.12 versus 39.0. It is a completely different reality.
And this circles perfectly back to the strength of their health and education pillars. What a rate of 1.12 tells us is that young women in Hong Kong have exceptional, unrestricted access to reproductive health care, family planning, and sexual education.
They have control.
Yes, it means they possess the bodily autonomy to delay childbirth. And why is that crucial? Because early childbirth is one of the primary mechanisms globally that derails female education.
Well, you can't achieve 16.9 expected years of schooling if girls are being forced out of high school to raise children.
Exactly. The empowerment to control their own reproduction is there. The educational access is there. The system is protecting young women incredibly well. It is strictly the translation of those early advantages into long-term equitable economic power that remains the broken link in the chain.
Okay, let's take a deep breath.
We've covered a lot.
We have unpacked a tremendous amount of invisible architecture so far. We started with the standard yardstick and saw the gleaming skyscraper of a 0.95 HDI score.
Yeah.
Then we applied the first filter of inequality and saw how the 24% income gap cracks the foundation and drops their global rank. We applied the second filter of gender and saw how an 11% labor force gap leaves half the society's intellectual capital parked in the garage.
It's a complex picture.
It is. We have thoroughly examined how development is distributed across social classes and how it is distributed across genders. But now we have to zoom out one final time.
The biggest lens of all.
Yes. We have to apply the final and perhaps the most existentially terrifying invisible filter of all. We have to ask, how is this hyperdevelopment distributed across generations? What is the actual physical cost of building this 88-year lifespan, $85,000 income skyscraper to the Earth itself?
We are moving from the social ledger, which deals with how we treat each other, to the ecological ledger, which deals with how we treat the planet that sustains us.
The ultimate reality check.
Exactly. In 2020, recognizing that you cannot separate human progress from the environment, the UN introduced a groundbreaking, highly disruptive new metric, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
I look at the PHDI as the moment the bill finally comes due at the restaurant.
Oh, that's good.
Right. For 30 years, we've been ordering the finest steaks and the most expensive wine, celebrating our rising HDI score. The PHDI is the waiter handing us the check.
And it is a very expensive check.
This metric takes the standard human development score and actively discounts it based on two specific, hard-nosed ecological realities: a country's carbon dioxide emissions per capita and its material footprint per capita.
Let's spend a moment defining that second term because it is crucial. The material footprint is a fascinating and often misunderstood metric.
How so?
Most people, when they think of environmental impact, think of what their country physically digs out of the ground within its own borders.
Right, like local coal mines or logging.
Exactly. But the material footprint measures true appetite. It calculates the total amount of raw materials, the biomass from agriculture, the fossil fuels burned for energy, the metal ores mined for electronics,
All the stuff we use.
and the non-metallic minerals like sand and gravel used to build those literal skyscrapers. And crucially, it measures the materials required to satisfy the consumption demands of your society, regardless of where in the world those materials were originally extracted.
Oh, wow. So if Hong Kong imports millions of smartphones, the lithium mined in South America to make the batteries, that counts against Hong Kong's material footprint because their consumption drove the extraction.
Exactly. It prevents wealthy nations from offshoring their environmental damage to poorer manufacturing countries and claiming to be green. It measures the true weight of a society's lifestyle on the Earth.
And when you factor in these planetary pressures, the carbon and the material appetite, the global picture of human progress changes drastically. The slide for this, slide 11, uses this dashboard graphic. It has a speedometer pushing deep into the red and this shrinking circle inside the HDI score.
Yes. The global HDI of 0.756 shrinks by 10.05%. It drops all the way down to a PHDI of 0.608.
We instantly lose a tenth of our perceived global progress the moment we account for the environmental damage required to achieve it.
It is a sobering statistical haircut.
Let's apply this to our masterclass case study. Let's look at Hong Kong's specific ecological leisure. In 2023, Hong Kong's per capita carbon dioxide emissions sat at roughly 4.52 tons per person.
Now, to be fair, 4.52 tons is actually lower than some heavily industrialized or sprawling nations like the United States or Australia.
True, but for a highly compact, densely populated urban center that relies heavily on public transit, 4.52 tons is still a massive pressure point on the atmosphere.
It is. However, the carbon is only half the story. The more alarming trend is the global context of material consumption that supports top-tier, service-based economies like Hong Kong's.
And this is where the historical data set from 1990 to 2023 delivers its starkest warning. Slide 12 uses this gray step chart with a bright red line tracking the climb.
The human material footprint globally has climbed at an astonishing, frankly terrifying rate over the past 30 years.
Lay the numbers on us.
In 1990, the global average material footprint was 8.67 tons of raw earth extracted per person per year. By 2023, that number had skyrocketed to 12.71 tons per person.
Let's visualize that math. That is an increase of over 4 tons of physical earth rock, oil, trees, sand extracted and consumed for every single human being on the planet compared to 30 years ago.
Yes.
It represents nearly a 50% increase in our global appetite for raw materials.
This data raises an unavoidable question, and it is perhaps the most important question of the 21st century. How long can a highly developed economy sustain its trajectory if the underlying material footprint required to maintain it continues a 50% climb every 3 decades?
It can't.
Right. It is not a matter of politics, it is a matter of physics. It is a systemic risk. The data clearly shows that the prosperity of the current top-tier nations is inherently subsidized by the ecological degradation of the planet.
I want to bring back the credit card analogy because I think it fits so perfectly here.
Go for it.
We are living a high HDI lifestyle on a low PHDI credit limit. We are throwing an incredible, lavish party in the penthouse of our human development skyscraper. We are toasting our 0.955 score, our 88-year life expectancy, our massive wealth.
Pops and champagne.
Exactly. But we are paying for the catering by swiping a credit card that borrows directly against the development capacity of the next 30 years. At some point, the Earth's credit limit maxes out and the debt is called in.
And we must understand the causality here. That ecological debt will not just manifest as abstract environmental metrics. It will directly, violently impact the very foundations of the HDI we have spent this entire deep dive analyzing.
How so?
Ecological collapse lowers life expectancy by expanding the range of tropical diseases, increasing the frequency of lethal heat waves, and disrupting food supplies.
So the health pillar crumbles.
Yes. And it destroys economies through extreme weather events that wipe out infrastructure. It forces schools to close during climate emergencies, eroding the expected years of schooling.
So the education and wealth pillars crumble too.
Exactly. The PHDI is not just a guilt trip from environmentalists. It is a mathematical warning that our current definition of an A-plus society is ecologically insolvent. We are cannibalizing the foundation to build the penthouse higher.
Wow. Which brings us to the final act of our deep dive today. We have laid all the cards on the table. We've looked at the standard yardstick, the inequality gap, the gender paradox, and the ecological debt. Now, we have to synthesize all these disparate filters back together.
We have to form a complete picture.
Right. We have to form a complete, accurate picture of what human development actually means and where we go from here. The academic presentation we are analyzing concludes with this brilliant conceptual tool on slide 13. It's called a multidimensional radar.
Imagine a radar chart, not as a single dot on a graph, but as a complex, multi-sided shape spreading out from the center.
And on this specific visual, they've superimposed Hong Kong's shape over the global average shape. And they actually put a little magnifying glass icon right over the income section.
Because when you plot Hong Kong on this radar, it truly emerges as the ultimate prototype of modern human development. On this radar, Hong Kong has long boards.
What do you mean by long boards?
These are the metrics where it absolutely excels. Its health and longevity board, its raw wealth board, its educational access board. These lines stretch out to the absolute outer edges of human possibility. They are triumphs of policy and human effort.
The A-plus student traits.
Exactly. But then you have the short boards, the 24% income inequality that fractures the society.
The magnifying glass.
Right. The 11% workplace gender gap that stifles female economic power. The mounting ecological pressure from a rapidly expanding material footprint.
And what do these short boards do to the shape?
These short boards are deeply hidden beneath the headline numbers, but they are pulling the entire shape of the society inward. They create an architecture that is highly advanced, but structurally imbalanced.
So the critical question for policymakers, and really for all of us observing global progress, is this. What is the prescription? How does a society move from merely chasing a high numerical score to achieving a quality top-tier status?
The focus has to fundamentally shift. And slide 14 outlines this beautifully in a simple two-column layout.
Right, because you cannot just keep relying on the old playbook.
Yeah.
You can't just keep trying to raise the average life expectancy from 88 to 89 or from 89 to 90. You hit a wall of diminishing returns.
The biological and infrastructural costs of adding that 89th year is astronomical compared to the benefit.
Exactly. The low-hanging fruit of basic human development has already been picked in these top-tier nations. The next phase of progress is not about additive growth. It is about structural restructuring.
According to the analysis, to create a balanced radar, a society must focus on shrinking that 24% wealth gap. This means implementing tax structures that actively redistribute capital, creating affordable housing markets that don't drain the middle class, and ensuring equitable wage growth for service workers.
And it also requires unlocking that massive, artificially constrained reservoir of female potential.
Closing the labor participation gap means fundamentally redesigning the workplace. It means making it viable for women to excel in both the economy and the home without sacrificing one for the other.
Through things like subsidized care, flexible hours.
And destroying the cultural stigma around male caregiving.
The core takeaway from this entire 30-year data set, from the rise of the index in 1990 to the shock of the pandemic in 2020 to the stark realities of 2023, is that the base HDI is no longer the end game.
The HDI was a phenomenal tool for the 20th century. It successfully moved our global obsession past raw GDP and forced us to care about health and education.
But for the 21st century, it is not enough. The final slide of our source material strips everything away. It's just a white background with three simple keywords: fair wealth sharing, green coexistence, and gender equality.
Because true, sustainable development isn't just about accumulating massive wealth and pushing human lifespans to their biological limits.
It has to be about those three things: fair wealth sharing across all classes, green coexistence with the planet that sustains us, and true gender equality, not just in the classroom, but in the boardrooms and governments where power and capital are actually wielded.
At its core, engaging with this data is an exercise in critical thinking. It teaches us that we must never accept a single number, a single headline, or a single ranking at face value.
Right. A ranking of number 8 in the world is not a conclusion.
It is merely the starting point for a much deeper investigation.
And that is exactly why this deep dive matters directly to you, the listener. It doesn't matter if you live in the dense urban core of Hong Kong, or a flat in London, or an apartment in New York, or anywhere else on the globe.
The standard yardsticks we use to measure success, not just in our national economies, but often in our own personal lives and careers, are frequently designed to hide the reality of how things actually function.
They are designed to mask the friction.
They offer us the comforting illusion of the average, which allows us to celebrate the whole while completely ignoring the pain at the margins.
So as we wrap up this journey through the data, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something to carry with you that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
I'm listening.
If a society is only deemed highly developed by draining the Earth's finite resources to fuel a hyper-economy and then leaving a quarter of its own population behind in an ever-widening wealth gap, are we actually advancing forward as a species? Or are we just running incredibly fast on a treadmill that is structurally designed to break?
That is the question we all need to answer.
Next time you open an article and see a global ranking celebrating the newest A+ student, don't just look at who is winning. Look past the index and ask yourself, who exactly is that ranking leaving invisible?